Mountain Man paid $2 for a disabled girl. That's what folks in the trading post won't forget. They say he bought her like a sack of flour. But what they didn't see was the way she looked at him. The way her lips moved, soft as a prayer, and whispered his name, though she hadn't spoken in years. A girl the town left for worthless now clings to the only man who stood up when the bidding stopped. But in a land where a piece of paper means more than a human life, their bond is about to be tested. Because this man's mercy has stirred a bitter enemy, an enemy who knows the law, owns the land, and wants the girl back, not for family, but for power. When the church bell tolls and the town gathers to judge, a silent girl's voice may be the only thing that saves them both. Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trading post's muddy yard, where wagons and horses crowded between weather-worn buildings. The air hummed with the low murmur of commerce as settlers haggled over dry goods and Navajo women displayed their woven blankets. A few Ute families stood apart, their faces stern as they watched the gathering crowd. At the center of it all stood a crude wooden platform, hastily assembled from spare lumber. The auctioneer, a wiry man in a dusty black coat, gestured broadly while beside him sat a young girl in a broken wheelchair. Her dark hair fell forward, hiding her face as she gripped the chair's splintered arms. The wooden wheel hung askew, making the entire chair tilt at an awkward angle. "Next up for bid," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Got here some crippled half-breed kin. Previous family can't keep her no more." He gestured toward Lena, as if showing off livestock. "She don't speak much, but she's young and might make a decent worker for the right household." From his position near the back of the crowd, Jared Flint's jaw tightened. He sat rigid in his mule cart, watching the spectacle with growing disgust. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, and the way she hunched in that broken chair made something in his chest ache. "Opening bid at $2, the auctioneer announced. "Who'll give me $2? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few women whispered behind their hands. No one raised a hand or called out. "Come now," the auctioneer cajoled. "Surely someone can use an extra pair of hands around their place. $1 then?" The silence stretched thin as morning frost. Lena's shoulders trembled slightly, though whether from the cool air or shame, Jared couldn't tell. $2, Jared called out suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. He hadn't planned to speak, hadn't even thought about it. The words just came. Laughter rippled through the crowd. A few men elbowed each other, grinning at his expense. "Mountain Man's got himself a bride," someone called out, triggering more snickers. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose, but he recovered quickly. $2 bid. Do I hear 3? Anyone for $3? When no other bids came, he brought down his hand with a sharp crack. "Sold to the gentleman in the mule cart." Jared climbed down from his seat, boots squelching in the mud as he made his way to the platform. He pulled $2 silver from his coat pocket and handed them to the auctioneer without meeting the man's eyes. Then he turned to Lena. She sat so still, she might have been carved from stone. Up close, he could see the frayed edges of her calico dress, the way her thin shoulders drew up defensively when he approached. With gentle hands that belied his size, Jared lifted her from the wheelchair. She weighed no more than a child, her body tense in his arms. The crowd parted as he carried her back to his cart. Some watched with curiosity, others with judgment in their eyes. Jared ignored them all, focusing on setting Lena down carefully on the wooden seat. As he turned to retrieve her wheelchair, a drunk rancher stumbled forward. "Hey, half-breed," the man slurred. "How much did your pa sell you for?" His words carried the bite of cruel amusement. The crowd's murmuring ceased. In the sudden quiet, a small voice spoke. Jared. The single word, barely above a whisper, stopped everything. Jared turned slowly to look at Lena. She had lifted her head, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. Her dark eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. The onlookers stared, caught between disbelief and wonder. The drunk rancher's mouth hung open, his taunt forgotten. Someone in the crowd gasped softly. Jared's heart clenched in his chest, hard enough to hurt. That one word, his name on her lips, carried the weight of years of silence. He didn't know her story, didn't know why she hadn't spoken until now, but he recognized the trust she'd just placed in him. Moving carefully, as if approaching a spooked deer, Jared folded the broken wheelchair and secured it in the back of his cart. The crowd remained hushed, watching as he climbed up beside Lena. She sat straight now, though her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Without another word to anyone, Jared picked up the reins. The mule's hooves clomped steadily as they pulled away from the trading post, leaving behind the staring faces and whispered conversations. Beside him, Lena's breathing came quick and shallow, but she kept her head high, facing forward into the morning sun. The mule's hooves crunched through fresh snow as Jared guided the cart along the winding mountain path. Winter had come early this year, dusting the pines with white and turning the afternoon air sharp as a blade. The old cart creaked and swayed with each bump, making the hour-long journey feel longer. Lena sat bundled in Jared's arms, wrapped in his thick wool blanket. Despite the covering, she shivered against him, her slight frame trembling like an aspen leaf. Her wheelchair, secured in the back of the cart, rattled with every jolt of the wooden wheels. "Reckon the world ain't always kind?" Jared said softly, his breath frosting in the cold air. He didn't expect her to answer, but something in him needed to speak. "Folks can be mighty hard on those they don't understand." He adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, tucking it tighter. "But you're safe now. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." The mule plodded steadily onward as snowflakes began to drift down. Lena's dark eyes studied Jared's face, a mix of wonder and wariness in her gaze. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket, but her shoulders had begun to relax against him. "My line cabin's just up ahead," Jared continued, nodding toward a bend in the trail. "It ain't much to look at, but it's warm and dry." He clicked his tongue at the mule. "Got a good supply of firewood stacked, and there's rabbit stew left from yesterday's hunting." As they rounded the curve, his cabin came into view. The simple log structure stood sturdy against the gathering snow, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A split rail fence marked the edge of his small clearing, and stacked cordwood lined the cabin's northern wall. Jared drew the cart to a stop near the cabin's door. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." He lifted Lena as gently as he had at the trading post, carrying her through the door while snow collected on their shoulders. The cabin's interior was plain but tidy. A potbelly stove squatted in one corner, its black iron surface reflecting the dim light. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt occupied another wall, while rough-hewn shelves held tools and supplies. Everything spoke of solitude and practical necessity. Jared set Lena down on a sturdy wooden chair, then retrieved her wheelchair from the cart. He positioned it near the stove, checking the broken wheel. "I can fix this wheel tomorrow," he said, running calloused fingers over the splintered wood. "Make it roll proper again." Moving to the stove, he added split logs and stirred the banked coals until flames licked upward. The iron door creaked as he closed it, and soon heat began to spread through the small space. Lena watched his every movement, her eyes following him as he moved about the cabin. "You must be hungry." Jared lifted a cast iron pot onto the stove's surface. "Got some rabbit stew here, made it fresh yesterday." He stirred the pot's contents, the rich aroma of herbs and meat filling the air. "My pa taught me to cook, said a man ought to know how to feed himself proper." When the stew was hot, he filled a tin bowl and brought it to Lena, along with a spoon and a chunk of cornbread. She accepted it with trembling hands, the steam rising between them like a veil. Her first bite was hesitant, but hunger soon took over and she ate steadily, soaking up the broth with pieces of bread. Outside, snow continued to fall as evening drew in. Jared lit a kerosene lamp, its yellow light casting long shadows on the log walls. He sat in his own chair, giving Lena space while staying close enough if she needed anything. The quiet stretched between them, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Then, soft as falling snow, a melody rose in the cabin's dim light. Lena was humming, her eyes half closed as the tune flowed from her lips. Jared's hands froze in the act of stoking the fire. He knew that song. The notes pulled at his heart like physical things, carrying him back through years of loneliness to happier days. His late wife, Sarah, had sung that very lullaby while weaving at her loom, her voice as gentle as summer rain. The Navajo melody spoke of stars and wind, of mother's love and peaceful dreams. Each note seemed to fill the cabin with memories of Sarah's smile, her quiet strength, the way she had brought warmth to his solitary life before illness took her away. Lena's humming faded to silence. She opened her eyes to find Jared staring at her, his weathered face soft with wonder and something close to recognition. Their gazes met across the lamp-lit space, and in that moment, something shifted between them. It was as if an invisible thread had been drawn taut, connecting their separate stories into something new and unexpected. Jared cleared his throat, trying to find words for what he felt. That she would know this song, that it would find him again after so many years of silence, seemed more than mere chance. His hands shook slightly as he added another log to the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney like ascending stars. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the plank floor. Jared stood at his cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of coffee and frying salt pork. The familiar scents filled the small space as Lena sat in her wheelchair by the table, watching him with quiet attention. The sudden clatter of hooves outside broke their peaceful morning routine. Jared's head snapped up at the sound of someone dismounting. Heavy boots thumped up the 3 wooden steps to his door, followed by 3 sharp knocks that echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Flint, open this door immediately!" A woman's stern voice cut through the crisp morning air. Jared shot Lena a reassuring glance before crossing to the door. He opened it to find Miss Clarissa Prindle, the missionary agent from the Indian Affairs Office, standing rigidly on his porch. Her black dress and severe expression matched her reputation for strict adherence to regulations. "Ma'am," Jared said, touching the brim of his hat. "What brings you up the mountain this early?" Miss Prindle's sharp eyes darted past him to where Lena sat. "I've come about the girl, Mr. Flint. There are serious concerns about yesterday's proceedings at the trading post." She pulled a folded document from her leather satchel. "Lena Yazzie is registered as a state ward. You had no legal right to purchase her guardianship." "I didn't purchase guardianship," Jared said quietly, his jaw tightening. "I paid that auctioneer to stop treating her like property." "Nevertheless," Miss Prindle pressed her lips into a thin line, "she must be surrendered to proper authorities. I have orders to take her to the Territorial Home for Indigenous Wards." Jared's frame filled the doorway, his shadow falling across Miss Prindle's boots. "No." "I beg your pardon?" "You ain't taking her anywhere." Jared's voice remained level, but steel ran through his words. "She stays here." Miss Prindle drew herself up to her full height, though she still barely reached Jared's shoulder. "Mr. Flint, you have no legal claim to this girl, unless you can prove some legitimate relationship." "She's my wife." The words burst from Jared's mouth before he could think them through. Behind him, he heard Lena's small intake of breath. Miss Prindle's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. "Your wife?" Her tone dripped with disbelief. "Do you expect me to believe you married this girl properly?" Jared's hands clenched at his sides, but he held the missionary's skeptical gaze. "That's exactly what I expect you to believe, ma'am." "Then you can provide proof of this marriage?" Miss Prindle withdrew a small notebook and pencil. "Documentation? Witnesses?" Sweat beaded on Jared's neck despite the morning chill. "Need some time to gather the papers. They're not all in one place." "Indeed." Miss Prindle made a sharp note in her book. "Very well, Mr. Flint. You have 1 week to present yourself at the agency office with proof of your marriage. If you fail to do so, I will return with the sheriff to collect Miss Yazzie." She snapped her notebook shut. "Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." Miss Prindle's eyes moved to Lena again, softening slightly. "Girl, are you being treated well here?" Lena met the missionary's gaze steadily and nodded once. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, showing no sign of distress. "1 week, Mr. Flint." Miss Prindle turned on her heel and strode back to her horse. They watched as she mounted and rode away, her straight back disappearing down the snowy trail. Jared closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly feeling every one of his 45 years. "I'm sorry, Lena," he said roughly. "Shouldn't have said that without asking. Just couldn't bear the thought of them taking you to that territorial home." He'd heard stories about those places: cold dormitories, harsh discipline, children forbidden to speak their native languages. He turned to face her, expecting fear or anger. Instead, Lena's face held a faint smile, small but real. It transformed her features, bringing light to her eyes that he hadn't seen before. The coffee pot chose that moment to boil over, breaking the tension. Jared hurried to move it off the heat, then served them both breakfast: salt pork, cornbread, and strong coffee for him, willow tea for her. They ate in companionable silence, the morning sun warming the cabin's interior. Jared's mind raced as he chewed his food. He had no idea how to prove a marriage that didn't exist. But looking at Lena across the table, watching her carefully butter her cornbread, he knew he'd find a way. The territorial home would break her spirit, maybe forever. Here, she was already beginning to bloom, like a wildflower finding sunlight after too long in shadow. Lena caught him watching her and tilted her head questioningly. The gesture was so natural, so trusting, that it made his chest ache. Whatever came next, he would protect her. Somehow they would face it together, this strange new marriage neither of them had planned. Jared surveyed his cabin with fresh eyes as morning light streamed through the window. What had seemed functional for a solitary mountain man now looked cluttered and hazardous for Lena's wheelchair. Stacks of supplies crowded the floors, and the doorway's high threshold would be impossible for her to navigate alone. "Reckon we need to make some changes," he said, running a calloused hand along the doorframe. Lena watched from her place by the table, her dark eyes following his movements with quiet interest. He started outside, choosing a wide plank from his lumber pile. The saw's teeth bit into the wood with rhythmic strokes as he shaped a gentle slope. Sawdust scattered across the snow as he worked, the familiar scent of fresh-cut pine filling the air. Through the window, he caught glimpses of Lena observing his labor, her expression curious. The morning sun climbed higher as Jared measured and cut, determined to get the angle just right. Finally, he secured the ramp with sturdy pegs, testing it with his full weight. "That ought to hold," he muttered, satisfied when it didn't so much as creak. Inside, the real work began. Years of bachelor living had left the cabin in what Jared now realized was an embarrassing state. Dried herbs hung in tangled bunches from the rafters. Hunting gear leaned haphazardly in corners. Stacks of newspapers and almanacs teetered precariously on every surface. He caught Lena hiding a smile behind her hand as he muttered and sorted through the chaos. "Don't suppose you find this amusing?" he asked, his own lips twitching despite himself. Her eyes sparkled in response, and she gestured at a particularly unstable pile of books that had just slid onto the floor. All right, he chuckled, gathering up the fallen volumes. I admit it ain't exactly orderly in here. Throughout the afternoon, Jared cleared paths wide enough for Lena's wheelchair. He arranged his tools on higher shelves, swept years of dust from forgotten corners, and organized his supplies into neat rows. Every so often, he'd glance at Lena for approval, and she'd nod encouragingly or point to spots he'd missed. As evening approached, he lit the lantern and hung it from its hook, casting a warm glow through the now tidier cabin. The pot of rabbit stew he'd set to simmer earlier filled the air with savory aromas. Jared ladled generous portions into 2 bowls, placing one before Lena, along with a slice of cornbread. They ate in comfortable silence until Lena pointed to her spoon, tilting her head in question. Jared understood immediately. That there's a spoon, he said clearly, holding up his own utensil. Can you say that? Spoon? Lena's lips moved silently at first, practicing the shape of the word. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. Spoon. Pride swelled in Jared's chest. That's right, clear as a bell too. Encouraged, Lena pointed to the crackling hearth. Fire, Jared pronounced carefully. Hot fire keeping us warm. Fire, she echoed, her voice growing slightly stronger. A small smile graced her features at the accomplishment. They continued this way through supper, Lena pointing and Jared naming bowl, table, lamp. Each word she repeated was like a small victory, building bridges between their worlds one syllable at a time. As night settled in and the temperature dropped, Jared turned his attention to sleeping arrangements. He'd already decided to give Lena his bed, but he wanted her closer to the stove's warmth. With careful movements, he positioned his old army cot near the hearth, layering it with blankets and his softest quilt. Here now, he said, wheeling her chair close to the cot. This'll keep you cozy through the night. That stove puts out good heat, and I'll feed it before I turn in. Lena ran her hand over the quilted surface, then looked up at him with such genuine gratitude that Jared had to clear his throat against a sudden tightness. Well then, he said gruffly, helping her settle onto the cot. He made sure the blankets were tucked securely around her shoulders, then added another log to the stove. The fire popped and crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lena's eyes were already growing heavy, but she reached out and touched Jared's sleeve lightly. Thank you, she whispered, the words clear and heartfelt. Jared patted her hand gently. You're welcome, Lena. Sleep well now. He watched as her breathing deepened into slumber, her face peaceful in the firelight. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, despite the winter wind whistling outside. It wasn't just the cleaned floors or cleared pathways. Something else had shifted. Something that made the space feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Jared hitched his mule to the cart. The morning air held a sharp bite, promising another cold day ahead. He glanced at Lena, who sat wrapped in layers of wool blankets, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Town's about an hour away, he explained, settling beside her on the wooden seat. Figured we ought to make this marriage proper-like. The mule's hooves clopped steadily against the frozen ground as they set out, following the winding trail down from the cabin. Lena huddled closer as they rode, seeking warmth. Jared noticed how she kept her eyes forward, her shoulders tense whenever they passed other travelers on the road. He understood why when they finally reached the town's outskirts. The streets were busy with morning traffic, wagons creaking, horses stomping, townsfolk hurrying about their business. As Jared guided the cart down Main Street, conversations hushed. Heads turned. Whispers followed them like autumn leaves in the wind. Ain't that the mountain man? With that crippled squaw wife? Lord have mercy. Jared's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes straight ahead. Beside him, Lena seemed to shrink deeper into her blankets, though her chin remained lifted with quiet dignity. They stopped first at the white-painted church that stood at the edge of town, its spire reaching toward heaven like an accusing finger. "Wait here," Jared said softly, helping Lena arrange the blankets more snugly around her shoulders. "Won't be but a minute." Inside the church, the preacher's study smelled of pipe tobacco and dusty books. Reverend Marshall peered at Jared over wire-rimmed spectacles, his expression growing more troubled with each word of explanation. "A marriage service?" The preacher's fingers drummed against his desktop. "Mr. Flint, this is irregular. The young woman's condition, her ability to consent—" "She's got all her wits about her," Jared interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Just don't speak much is all. There are legal considerations." Reverend Marshall shuffled through some papers. "Documentation needed. And given her background, there may be territorial statutes to consider." Jared's patience, never his strongest virtue, began to wear thin. His hands, resting on the preacher's desk, curled into fists. "Ain't asking for your blessing, Reverend. Just a proper service. Make it legal and right." "Mr. Flint, I sympathize with your situation, but I cannot in good conscience—" "Much obliged for your time," Jared cut in, already turning towards the door. His boots echoed heavily on the wooden floor as he strode out, letting the door close with more force than strictly necessary. He found Lena exactly where he'd left her, though she'd been watching the activity around Peterson's mercantile across the street. Her eyes held a spark of interest he hadn't seen before. "Reckon we could use some supplies while we're here," he said, eager to leave the church's shadow behind. He helped Lena down from the cart, settling her carefully in her wheelchair before pushing her toward the store. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Mrs. Peterson, a plump woman with kind eyes, looked up from her ledger. Unlike the others, she offered a genuine smile. "Morning, Mr. Flint. Ma'am." Jared nodded in greeting, pushing Lena's chair past shelves stocked with dry goods and sundries. He was examining bags of flour when he noticed Lena had gone completely still, her attention fixed on something across the store. Following her gaze, he spotted the display of yarns and threads, dozens of skeins in every color imaginable. Lena's hands moved in an unmistakable weaving motion, and she turned to look up at him, her eyes bright with longing. "You want some of that yarn?" he asked. Lena nodded eagerly, the most animated he'd seen her yet. Her fingers pointed to specific colors, deep reds, rich browns, sunny yellows. "We'll take these," Jared told Mrs. Peterson, gathering the skeins Lena indicated. He added a few more when he saw how Lena's face lit up at each new color. The total came to more than he'd planned to spend, but seeing Lena clutch the wrapped package to her chest made it worth every penny. The ride home felt lighter somehow, despite the continued stares from townspeople as they departed. The mule plodded steadily along the familiar trail, and Lena began to hum, a gentle, wandering melody that seemed to match the rhythm of their journey. She held her precious yarns close, occasionally running her fingers over the brown paper wrapping, as if to reassure herself they were real. Jared watched her from the corner of his eye, something warm settling in his chest. It was the first thing she'd asked for, the first clear want she'd expressed. Somehow those simple skeins of colored yarn meant more than their modest cost might suggest. They were Lena's choice, her small declaration of self in a world that had given her precious few choices before. Back at the cabin, afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the plank floor. Lena sat in her wheelchair by the hearth, her newly acquired yarns spread across her lap in a rainbow of colors. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, weaving strands into the beginning of what promised to be a beautiful basket. Jared worked nearby, his strong hands sanding rough spots from an old rocking chair he'd pulled from the corner. The rhythmic scratch of sandpaper and soft whisper of yarn created a peaceful melody in the quiet cabin. "Ain't much," Jared said, running his palm over the chair's arm, "but reckon it'll do once I get it fixed up proper." He glanced at Lena, who nodded encouragingly, her fingers never stopping their steady weaving. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney as Jared worked. He found himself talking more than usual, sharing tales from his younger days. "Was up in the high country once, tracking a particularly clever beaver," he began, his voice rough but warm. "That critter led me on a 3-day chase through the worst thickets you ever saw." Lena's hands stilled, her dark eyes fixed on him as he spoke. She seemed to drink in every word, occasionally tilting her head or smiling at particularly exciting moments. "Finally caught up to him near a stand of aspens," Jared continued, working a stubborn splinter free from the chair. "And wouldn't you know it? That beaver had himself a whole family nested up there. Couldn't bring myself to spring the trap after seeing those kits." To his surprise, Lena straightened in her chair, puffing out her chest. In a soft but deliberately gruff voice, she mimicked, "Couldn't spring trap." Jared's laugh burst forth, unexpected and genuine. It had been so long since he'd laughed like that, the sound almost startled him. Lena's eyes danced with delight at his reaction, and she tried again, making her voice even rougher. "Clever beaver." "That's right good," Jared chuckled, shaking his head. "You got my voice down perfect." He noticed how her shoulders relaxed at his approval, how her smile grew more confident. The peaceful afternoon stretched on, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire or the scrape of Jared's tools against wood. Lena's basket took shape, rich colors blending together in an intricate pattern that reminded Jared of sunset over the mountains. The sharp rap of knuckles on the cabin door shattered their tranquil moment. Miss Prindle stood on the threshold, her stern face pinched with concern. Cold air rushed in as Jared opened the door wider, gesturing for her to enter. "Mr. Flint," she said, removing her gloves with precise movements, "I've come with troubling news." Her eyes darted to Lena, who had set aside her weaving and sat straight in her chair, watching. "Folks in town are circulating a petition," Miss Prindle continued. "They mean to challenge the legitimacy of your arrangement with Miss Yazzie. They're claiming it's improper, possibly even illegal under territorial law." Jared's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Ain't nothing improper about it. Nevertheless, there are those who object, strongly." Miss Prindle's boots clicked against the floor as she paced. "They're pressuring Reverend Marshall to deny any marriage service, and without that—" "We'll be at Sunday service," Jared interrupted, his tone firm. "Front pew. Let them see us plain as day, sitting there proper as anyone else." Lena's soft gasp drew both their attention. Her eyes were wide, moving between Jared and Miss Prindle. "Mr. Flint," Miss Prindle began, "are you certain that's wise?" "The situation is already volatile." "Ain't hiding," Jared stated simply. He moved to stand beside Lena's chair, his hand resting protectively on its back. "She's my wife, or we'll be proper soon enough. Townfolk can either accept that or not, but we'll not skulk around like we done something wrong." Miss Prindle studied them both for a long moment. Something in her severe expression softened slightly as she watched Lena reach up and place her small hand over Jared's larger one. "Very well," she said finally. "I'll note your intentions in my report. But be prepared, Mr. Flint. This won't be easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Jared replied. After Miss Prindle departed, silence filled the cabin once more. But it was different now, charged with purpose and shared resolve. Lena picked up her weaving again, her movements more determined than before. Jared returned to the rocking chair, working with renewed vigor. As evening settled around them, their quiet industry continued, each focused on their task but drawing strength from the other's presence. Every so often, Lena would catch Jared's eye and attempt another gruff imitation of his voice, bringing that rare smile back to his weathered face. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, frost etching delicate patterns on the cabin's small window panes. Jared stood before his clouded mirror, drawing a freshly stropped razor carefully along his jaw. He hadn't shaved proper in weeks, and the blade revealed forgotten planes of his weathered face. Behind him, he could hear Lena humming softly as she braided her long, dark hair. "Reckon we ought to make a good showing," he muttered, wiping lather from his neck. The trunk in the corner had yielded unexpected treasures, among them a fine wool shawl in deep burgundy that must have belonged to his mother. Now it lay across his bed, waiting for Lena. Jared turned to find Lena watching him in the mirror, a hint of anxiety in her dark eyes. "You look right handsome," she whispered, the words coming easier now after days of practice. He ducked his head, unused to compliments. "And you'll look fine too," he replied, retrieving the shawl. With gentle hands, he draped it around her shoulders, making sure it covered her well against the morning chill. The rich color brought warmth to her complexion, and for a moment he saw not the frightened girl from the auction block, but a woman of quiet dignity. The trip to town was slow going, their mule cart creaking over frozen ruts in the road. Lena sat close to Jared, the shawl pulled tight, her breath making small clouds in the crisp air. As they approached the white-painted church, the morning bell tolled across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. Townsfolk gathered on the steps fell silent as Jared brought the cart to a halt. He could feel their stares as he lifted Lena into her wheelchair, but he kept his movements unhurried, deliberate. The wooden ramp he'd built last week made getting up to the church door easier, though the wheels still caught on every board. Inside, the silence grew heavier. Jared wheeled Lena straight to the front pew, just as he'd promised Miss Prindle. The scrape of her chair wheels echoed in the hushed sanctuary. As he settled beside her, he heard the rustle of clothes and murmured comments behind them, but he kept his eyes forward, fixed on the simple wooden cross above the altar. Reverend Marshall entered, his steps faltering slightly at the sight of them. But to his credit, he recovered quickly, offering them a small nod before beginning the service. His sermon that morning, whether by chance or design, centered on Christ's teachings about mercy and human dignity. "For in God's eyes," the Reverend's voice rang out, "all souls carry equal worth. It is not our place to judge the worth of another, but to show kindness to all who cross our path." Lena's hand found Jared's as the Reverend spoke. Her fingers were warm and steady against his calloused palm. He squeezed back gently, letting her know he was there. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to disperse, several townspeople approached their pew. Mrs. Baker, the mercantile owner's wife, was first, her round face creased in a tentative smile. "That's a lovely shawl, dear," she said to Lena. "It suits you well." Lena ducked her head shyly, but managed a clear "thank you" that seemed to surprise Mrs. Baker. Others followed, some offering genuine if awkward welcomes, others barely concealing their disapproval behind tight smiles and carefully chosen words. "Quite a responsibility you've taken on, Mr. Flint," said Henry Webb, the banker, his tone suggesting Jared might not be equal to the task. "One I'm grateful for," Jared replied evenly, his hand still steady on Lena's wheelchair. Miss Prindle observed from near the door, her expression unreadable as she watched the interactions unfold. When she caught Jared's eye, she gave a small, approving nod. The ride home felt lighter somehow, despite the weight of all those stares and whispered comments still fresh in their minds. The afternoon sun had warmed the air, making the frost retreat to shadowy corners. Their mule plodded contentedly along the familiar path, while overhead, a hawk circled lazily in the clear blue sky. Lena's face was turned up to catch the sunlight, her eyes closed in peaceful contemplation. The burgundy shawl glowed richly in the golden light, and Jared found himself studying her profile, noting how she seemed to sit straighter now, with more confidence than before. Did good today, he said quietly. She opened her eyes and smiled at him, a real smile that reached all the way to her eyes. We did, she replied, her voice soft but clear. They continued their journey in comfortable silence, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the distant call of that soaring hawk. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they had faced the town together and held their ground. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning. The days following their church appearance settled into a gentle rhythm at the cabin. Morning light streamed through freshly cleaned windows, catching dust motes that danced above the wooden floor Jared had scrubbed smooth for Lena's wheelchair. The familiar scent of pine smoke mingled with the rich aroma of simmering stew. Like this, Jared demonstrated, showing Lena how to grip the long wooden spoon with her left hand. Her right remained mostly still in her lap, but her left arm had proven strong and capable. She watched intently as he stirred the thick broth in slow, deliberate circles. Your turn now, he said, carefully transferring the spoon to her grip. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, and though they trembled slightly at first, she found her rhythm. The wooden spoon scraped gently against the iron pot's bottom as she stirred, her face set in concentration. Good, Jared nodded, watching the vegetables and meat swirl in the savory broth. Real good. Lena's lips curved in a small smile of accomplishment. Then, pointing to the steaming pot with her free hand, she spoke a word in Navajo. Atu. Atu, Jared repeated carefully, the foreign syllables feeling strange on his tongue. That means stew? She nodded, pleased. This had become their daily practice. She would teach him words from her mother's language, and he would help her strengthen her English. Each word shared between them built another small bridge of understanding. Near the hearth, Lena's basket was taking shape. A beautiful blend of store-bought yarn and local grasses she had directed Jared to gather. Her fingers worked steadily, weaving intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories he couldn't quite read. The colored yarn, deep reds, warm browns, and touches of gold, caught the firelight like sunset on distant mesas. Watching her work, Jared made a decision. County fair's coming in 2 days, he said, keeping his voice casual as he stoked the fire. Reckon that basket of yours ought to be entered in the crafts competition. Lena's hands stilled on her weaving. She looked up at him, eyes wide with surprise, and something that might have been hope. It's fine work, he continued. Folks ought to see it. Maybe even earn you a ribbon. The smile that bloomed across her face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Her fingers resumed their steady weaving with renewed purpose, and she hummed softly as she worked, a tune that spoke of joy and pride. That evening, they sat in comfortable silence as the lamp cast warm circles of light through the cabin. Jared had positioned his chair near enough to watch her finishing touches on the basket, but not so close as to make her nervous. The last strands of yarn were being woven into place, each movement precise and deliberate. When she finally set the completed basket in her lap, Jared could see it was more than just craft. It was art. The pattern reminded him of rain falling on summer dust, of storm clouds gathering over far peaks. Something of the land itself had been captured in those careful rows of weaving. Beautiful, he said simply. Lena traced her fingers along the rim of her creation, then looked up at him. In the lamplight, her dark eyes held a depth of emotion he hadn't seen before. Her lips parted, and she spoke with quiet certainty. Husband. The word hung in the air between them like a prayer. Jared felt his heart catch in his throat. This wasn't like at the church, where they had played roles for others' benefit. This was Lena choosing to name him, to claim him as her own. He swallowed hard, then found his voice. That's right, he said softly. Wife. The word felt right in his mouth, true in a way that went beyond their hasty arrangement. Lena's eyes shone with unshed tears, but her smile was steady. She lifted the basket and held it out to him, a gift freely given. Jared took it carefully, his rough hands gentle on the delicate weaving. Within the pattern, he now saw something more. A story of two lives becoming unexpectedly entwined, like the yarn and grasses woven together to make something stronger than either alone could be. They sat there in the warm lamplight, the basket between them. No more words needed. Outside, a coyote called across the valley, and somewhere in the distance, another answered. Like those wild voices finding each other in the dark, Jared and Lena had somehow found their way to this moment of quiet understanding. The lamp flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this peaceful evening, they were simply husband and wife, sharing the comfortable silence of home. Dawn broke crisp and clear on fair day. Jared wrapped Lena's prize basket in his softest wool blanket, tucking it carefully into the cart beside her wheelchair. The morning air held the last breath of summer, promising a perfect day for the county gathering. "Ready?" he asked, adjusting the blanket around Lena's shoulders. She nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. The basket had taken on special meaning for them both. More than just woven yarn and grass, it represented their growing bond and Lena's reawakening spirit. The mule cart creaked along the dirt road into town, where flags and banners already fluttered in the morning breeze. Music drifted from the fairgrounds, a fiddle's cheerful tune mixing with the deeper notes of a bass. The smell of fresh-baked pies and roasting corn filled the air. Jared helped Lena into her wheelchair, then lifted out her basket with the same care he might show a newborn lamb. Together, they made their way through the growing crowd to the handicrafts tent. Inside, tables displayed quilts, carved wooden figures, and other handmade treasures. The fair organizer, Mrs. Peterson, directed them to an empty space near the center. "My word," she breathed when Jared unwrapped the basket. "That's remarkable work." She adjusted her spectacles for a closer look at the intricate pattern. Lena's fingers twisted in her lap, but her chin lifted with quiet pride. After setting up the display, Jared wheeled Lena to the wood chopping area. "Got to defend my title," he explained, patting the axe handle at his belt. "You'll be able to see everything from right here." The contest drew a good crowd. 6 men lined up before their logs, axes gleaming in the midday sun. At the signal, steel bit into wood. Jared's powerful strokes fell in a steady rhythm, chips flying. His concentration never wavered, though he was aware of Lena watching intently from her place of honor near the judge's stand. Sweat darkened his shirt as he worked. The log began to groan, then split with a satisfying crack. Jared stepped back, breathing hard to see he'd finished second, beaten by young Tom Wilson's impressive showing. He accepted the silver medal with a good-natured nod. "Fine cutting," Tom said, extending his hand. "Taught me everything I know about axe work, if truth be told." "You learned well," Jared replied, shaking the offered hand. He noticed how Tom's eyes flickered respectfully to Lena, including her in the moment of sportsmanship. They were making their way to the pie stands when a commotion rose from the handicrafts tent. The judges had finished their deliberations. Curious onlookers gathered as Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat to announce the winners. "Third place for handicrafts goes to Sarah Miller's sunbonnet quilt," she proclaimed. "Second place to John Cooper's carved chess set." She paused, building anticipation. "And first place is awarded to Lena Flint's Navajo basket." A cheer went up from the crowd. Lena's eyes widened in surprise as Mrs. Peterson approached with a bright blue ribbon. "Extraordinary work, my dear," the older woman said warmly, pinning the ribbon to the basket's display. "Such artistry deserves recognition." People pressed forward to admire the winning piece. Several of the church ladies who had been cool toward them at services now offered sincere congratulations. Even the mercantile owner, who had witnessed their yarn purchase, came to shake Jared's hand. "Fine piece of work," he said, You two should be proud." Lena's face glowed with happiness as she accepted the compliments with shy nods. Jared stood beside her wheelchair, his hand resting protectively on its back, watching his wife bask in this moment of acceptance. The peaceful scene shattered when Jake Morrison, the drunk rancher who had jeered at them during the auction, shouldered his way through the crowd. His face was flushed with whiskey and anger. "Ain't right," he slurred, pointing an unsteady finger at the basket. "Cripples and half-breeds don't win for long in these parts, mark my words." The crowd fell silent. Jared felt his muscles tense, ready to defend Lena, but before he could move, Mrs. Peterson stepped forward. "That's quite enough, Jake Morrison," she said firmly. "This is a fair contest, judged on merit alone. The basket won because it deserves to win. Now move along before you embarrass yourself further." Other voices joined in support. "Beautiful work is beautiful work," someone called. "Don't matter who made it." The drunk rancher glared, but finding himself suddenly isolated, he stumbled away, muttering dark promises under his breath. Lena's hand found Jared's and squeezed it tight. He looked down to see not fear in her eyes, but quiet determination. She had won fairly, and no bitter words could take that away from her. The tension broke as someone struck up a fiddle tune. The crowd dispersed, returning to the fair's pleasures. Mrs. Peterson patted Lena's shoulder before moving on to other duties. The blue ribbon gleamed against the basket's intricate weave, a symbol of something larger than just a contest win. It marked the day when Lena Flint's craft had been judged solely on its merits and found exceptional. The ride home from the fair should have been triumphant. Lena's blue ribbon caught the late afternoon sun, dancing in the breeze as their cart rolled along the dusty road. But something had changed. The warmth of their victory dimmed as they passed the general store, where a cluster of women huddled in conversation. "Poor thing won't last the week in that cabin," one woman's voice carried clearly. "Once the government steps in, he'll turn her out sure as sunrise." "Men like that," another added. "They don't keep promises to her kind." Lena's shoulders stiffened. Jared felt her curl inward, withdrawing into herself like a flower closing at dusk. He wanted to stop the cart, to confront those gossips with their cruel assumptions, but he knew that would only make things worse. Instead, he clicked his tongue at the mule, urging it faster past the whispering women. The setting sun painted long shadows across the cabin yard when they arrived home. Jared helped Lena from the cart, noting how she avoided his gaze. Her earlier joy had vanished, replaced by a familiar remoteness that made his heart ache. He carried her basket inside, placing it carefully on the shelf where its blue ribbon could catch the lamplight. "Reckon that's the finest piece of weaving this county's seen," he said, trying to draw her out. But Lena only stared at her hands, folded still and silent in her lap. Through supper, she didn't hum or attempt words as she had begun to do. She barely touched her food, though Jared had made her favorite bean soup. When he helped her into her cot for the night, her face was turned to the wall, shoulders trembling slightly in the darkness. Jared lay awake long into the night, listening to the cabin's familiar creaks and groans. He understood fear, had known plenty of it himself in the mountains. But this fear that gripped Lena now was different. It was the terror of hope betrayed, of trust misplaced. Those gossiping women had voiced her deepest doubts, and he had no words fine enough to chase such shadows from her heart. Morning brought worse news. Jared was chopping kindling when he heard hoofbeats approaching. The telegraph boy, Tommy Wheeler, rode up with an official-looking envelope. "Important message from the territorial court, Mr. Flint," Tommy said, handing over the telegram. His young face was serious. "Pa said I should deliver it straight away." Jared's fingers felt thick and clumsy as he opened the envelope. The message was brief, but devastating. Legal claim filed by Jacob Morrison. Stop. Challenges. Validity of marriage to Ward. Lena Yazzie, stop. hearing set 3 days hence. Stop. Presence required at territorial court. Stop. The paper crackled in Jared's tightening grip. That drunken rancher had made good on his threats, using the law itself as his weapon. Fury rose in Jared's chest, hot as forge fire, but he forced it down. Anger wouldn't help Lena now. He paid Tommy and watched the boy ride away before turning toward the cabin. Through the window, he could see Lena at her usual morning spot by the stove, her fingers working listlessly at a new piece of weaving. The sight of her there, so naturally belonging in his home, made his determination stronger. Taking a deep breath, Jared stepped inside. Lena looked up, her dark eyes questioning. She had always been good at reading his moods. "Got some news," he said, keeping his voice steady. "That rancher Morrison's stirring up trouble. Filed papers saying our marriage ain't proper." He moved closer, kneeling beside her wheelchair so they were eye to eye. "But I'm making you a promise right here. We're going to make things right. Proper and legal the way it should be." Lena's fingers clutched her weaving tighter, her knuckles white with tension. A single tear traced down her cheek, but she didn't turn away this time. Instead, she reached out slowly and touched Jared's rough hand with her smaller one. "Husband," she whispered, the word carrying all her fear and hope in its 2 simple syllables. "That's right," he answered firmly, "and ain't no court paper or bitter drunk going to change that fact." He covered her hand with his own, careful and gentle. "We'll ride into town tomorrow, see the preacher again, make him understand this ain't just some scheme, it's about family." Her fingers relaxed slightly in his grasp, though worry still shadowed her face. Trust was a fragile thing, Jared knew, especially for someone who had seen so little of it in her life. But as he looked at their joined hands, his weathered and work-rough, hers small but strong from weaving, he knew with bone-deep certainty that this was worth fighting for. The morning sun streamed through the cabin window, catching the blue ribbon on Lena's basket. Yesterday's triumph seemed far away now, threatened by legal papers and old prejudices. But Jared had survived mountain winters and grisly encounters through sheer stubborn determination. He would face this challenge the same way, one step at a time, with Lena beside him. Dawn painted the eastern mountains gold as Jared guided his mule cart along the winding path to the Navajo settlement. The wheels creaked over stones and shallow creek beds, each jolt a reminder of his urgent mission. He had left Lena sleeping, tucked warm in her cot, with only a hastily scrawled note promising his quick return. The settlement appeared as the sun cleared the ridge, a cluster of wooden homes and hogans nestled against red cliff walls. Smoke rose from morning cook fires, carrying the scent of pinon wood. Children paused in their play to watch the stranger approach, their dark eyes curious but wary. Shilakai Neza's home stood apart from the others, marked by the traditional 8-sided shape and a small garden where herbs grew in careful rows. The elder himself sat on a bench outside, as if expecting visitors. His weathered face showed little surprise as Jared pulled his mule to a stop. "I knew you would come," Shilakai said, his voice steady and calm. "Word travels fast about the mountain man who married Sarah Yazzi's daughter." Jared dismounted, ducking his head in respect. "Then you knew her?" "Lena's mother." "I knew Sarah well." Shilakai gestured to the bench beside him. "She was wise in our ways, though she married outside. Come, sit. Tell me why you seek me out." Jared settled onto the rough-hewn bench, his large frame making it seem small. "There's trouble. A rancher's filed papers against our marriage. Says Lena's a ward of the state, claims I got no right to her." Shilakai's eyes narrowed slightly. "Jacob Morrison. The drunk who covets the spring lands." Spring lands. The elder reached inside his shirt, withdrawing a folded paper, yellow with age. "Sarah brought this to me before she died. A water rights claim, properly surveyed, but never filed. The spring that feeds the North Valley. It belongs to her bloodline, to Lena. Jared's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the document. The careful drawings showed the spring's course, the boundaries marked in faded ink. His mind raced, connecting pieces like a tracker reading sign. Morrison's ranch depends on that water. Yes. Shilakai nodded slowly. He knew Sarah had claim papers. When she died, he thought they were lost, but I kept them safe, waiting for the right time. He fixed Jared with a penetrating gaze. You truly care for the girl? She's my wife, Jared said simply. Maybe not by paper yet, but in my heart. The elder studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then you understand, this is not just about water rights. It is about her birthright, her mother's legacy. Jared carefully refolded the precious document. This changes everything. Morrison can't seize her as a ward if she's a landowner with valid claims. The agency will resist, Shilakai warned. They do not like to acknowledge our people's rights. Then we'll make them listen. Jared stood, his jaw set with determination. Will you help us? Speak for her mother's claim? I will come. Shilakai rose, his movements deliberate. Sarah's daughter deserves to hold her head high on her own land. The ride home seemed shorter, hope lending speed to the mule's steps. Jared found Lena by the cabin window, her fingers working thread, but her eyes distant with worry. She brightened at his return, then looked curious at his obvious excitement. Got something to tell you, he said, kneeling beside her wheelchair. He spread the water claim document carefully across her lap. This here's yours by right. Your mama left it with a friend, Shilakai Nez. It's papers for the springlands north of town. Lena's fingers traced the drawings, recognition dawning in her eyes. Mama's place? That's right. Jared's voice grew gentle. Morrison, that rancher causing trouble. He wants that water. That's why he's fighting so hard against us. But this here proves it's yours, fair and square. Tears welled in Lena's eyes as she stared at her mother's legacy. Her hands trembled over the precious document. We'll take this to the agency, Jared continued. Show them you ain't some helpless ward to be passed around. You're a landowner with proper claims. Shilakai's coming to speak for your mama's rights. Evening settled over the cabin like a soft blanket. Lena had insisted on keeping the document close, tucked safely in her shawl. Though hope had returned to her eyes, Jared could see exhaustion in the way her shoulders drooped. As he helped her prepare for bed, he remembered how she had once comforted him with song. Now it was his turn. Settling into the rocking chair near her cot, he began to hum the Navajo lullaby she had shared, the one his first wife had known. The melody was rough in his throat, unpracticed, but true. Lena's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with understanding. She nestled deeper into her blankets, letting the familiar tune wash over her. Gradually, her breathing steadied into sleep, peaceful despite the battles that lay ahead. Jared kept humming, watching shadows dance on the cabin walls. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight, in this moment, they were simply family, protecting each other, sharing songs that bridged two worlds. Dawn painted the agency office in shades of amber as three figures approached, Jared steering the mule cart with Lena beside him, and Shilakai following on his pinto pony. The morning air held a crisp bite, making Lena pull her shawl closer around the precious documents nestled against her chest. We want a public hearing, Jared announced firmly as they entered, his voice carrying through the cramped office where Miss Prindle sat at her desk. This concerns the whole town. Word spread quickly. Within the hour, townsfolk filled the agency's yard, their curiosity drawing them like moths to flame. The rancher, Morrison, swaggered in last, legal papers clutched in his meaty fist. His confident smirk faltered slightly at the sight of Shilakai. Miss Prindle called the hearing to order from behind her desk, her stern face betraying nothing. Mr. Morrison, present your case. Morrison slapped his papers down. Got here a legal claim to make this girl a ward of state. She ain't fit to manage herself, and that marriage ain't proper registered." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lena's fingers tightened on her shawl, but her chin stayed high. "Mr. Flint?" Miss Prindle's gaze shifted. Jared nodded to Shilakai, who stepped forward. The elder's dignity hushed the room as he withdrew the yellowed documents. "These are water rights claims," Shilakai explained, his voice clear and steady. "Properly surveyed, signed by Sarah Yazzie, Lena's mother. The spring that feeds the North Valley belongs to her bloodline." Miss Prindle examined the papers carefully, her practiced eye catching every detail. Morrison's face reddened as she compared dates and signatures. "These predate any other claims," she declared finally. "The water rights are legally binding. As the rightful heir, Miss Yazzie, Mrs. Flint, is a landowner in her own right." She fixed Morrison with a stern look. "Your petition to declare her a ward is hereby rejected." The crowd's mood shifted like wind changing direction. Whispers of respect replaced earlier scorn. Morrison stormed out, his boots kicking up dust. Lena's eyes shone with tears of triumph as she reached for Jared's hand. He squeezed it gently, his weathered face soft with pride. Shilakai nodded in quiet satisfaction, his mission to protect Sarah's legacy finally complete. Outside the agency office, the morning sun warmed the gathered crowd. Jared guided his mule cart to a quiet spot beneath an old cottonwood tree. The branches cast dappled shadows across Lena's face as she sat tall in her chair, still holding the precious documents that had secured her freedom. Jared took a deep breath, then lowered himself to one knee beside her wheelchair. His weathered hands, usually so sure with rope and timber, trembled slightly as they found hers. "Lena," he said, his voice gentle but carrying across the hushed yard. "What do you say we make this marriage proper? Not just for show or protection, but real and true." Lena's dark eyes met his, bright with emotion. The silence that had been her shield for so many years melted away as she spoke, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Jared Flint." Miss Prindle stepped forward, her usual stern expression softened by something that looked remarkably like joy. "I am authorized to perform civil ceremonies," she offered, smoothing her skirts. "If you'd like, we could do it right here and now." The townsfolk drew closer, forming a circle beneath the cottonwood. Someone scattered wildflowers around Lena's wheelchair. Shilakai and other tribal elders moved forward, their presence bridging the gap between two worlds. Jared stood beside Lena's chair as Miss Prindle opened her prayer book. The simple ceremony began, their words carried on the morning breeze. When Jared promised to cherish and protect, his voice was rough with emotion. Lena's vows, though softly spoken, rang with conviction and pride. The gathered crowd watched as two cultures blended in the ceremony. After Miss Prindle pronounced them husband and wife, the tribal elders stepped forward to offer traditional blessings. They were followed by townspeople who had once turned away, now offering congratulations and well wishes. Lena reached up to touch Jared's face, her smile radiant. He leaned down to kiss her forehead, then straightened, standing tall beside his bride. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair as he gazed down at Lena, his expression tender and fierce with love. What had begun as a desperate measure to protect a vulnerable soul had transformed into something profound, a covenant of love and dignity, witnessed by heaven and earth alike. In the weeks that followed their wedding, the rhythmic sounds of sawing and hammering echoed from Jared's workshop. He labored over sturdy wagon wheels, carefully measuring and fitting each spoke. His skilled hands shaped fresh pine wood into a frame, stronger and more comfortable than Lena's old chair. "Got to make it just right," he'd mutter, testing each joint and connection. Lena would watch from the doorway, her eyes bright with interest as she offered suggestions in her steadily strengthening voice. When the new wheelchair was finished, its polished wood gleaming in the sunlight, Jared lifted Lena into it with tender care. The wider wheels rolled smoothly over the cabin's wooden floors and down the plank ramp he'd built. Together, they became a familiar sight on the town's main street. Jared would push Lena past the mercantile, the blacksmith's shop, and the agency office. Where once there had been whispers and turned backs, now came friendly waves and respectful nods. Lena's voice, once silenced by fear, rang out in clear greetings to passers-by. Their cabin, once a lonely outpost, transformed into a gathering place. Every Sunday after church, settlers and Navajo families would share meals at their long table. Lena's weaving would rest beside Mrs. Peterson's quilting as children played in the yard. The air filled with blended languages and laughter, the smell of fresh bread mixing with traditional herb tea. Jared, who had spent so many years in solitude, found his heart expanding with each passing day. He watched Lena teach young girls to weave, her patience and gentle instruction drawing shy smiles from her students. His gruff chuckle, once rare, became a common sound. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jared and Lena sat together on their porch. Her hand rested in his as they watched the light fade over the distant mountains. The soft whisper of aspen leaves and the call of evening birds created a peaceful melody. "Who'd have thought," Jared said softly, squeezing her hand, "that buying a $2 bride would bring such richness?" Lena's answering smile held all the warmth of the setting sun. "Home," she said simply, the word carrying all the weight of their journey together. Around them, their cabin glowed with lamplight, welcoming and warm. Inside, the table still held evidence of the day's gathering: empty cups, scattered playing cards, and the comfortable signs of a house well lived in and deeply loved. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.